Bright lights. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the very last talk. I know everyone's probably quite tired, but I'm really excited to be here. Let's see. There we go. Very excited also to be in Tokyo. This is my second time. I was lucky enough to be here for TriSwift 2016, the first one, and it's such a joy to be back here. So, as I was introduced, I'm Maxim. Hi, everyone. I'm at MENNENIA on Twitter, and I'm a principal design technologist at Autodesk. Now, you may be wondering, what is that? Well, I like to call it a prototype for a living, basically. I'm an engineer that's part of a design team that works at Shotgun, and I make our experiences live so we can test them with people, and we can learn as quick as possible as to what direction to go in. And to me, this is a bit of a dream job. It's one that I've always wanted. Anyone that may have seen any of my work previously knows that I'm a big fan of both design and development, so this is a perfect mix. But it got me thinking that when I couldn't have done this when I started my career, if you will, because at that time, I was much more focused on what code I was writing, what languages I was using, what frameworks, and how to use them best. But over time, I have learned different ways of approaching it, and that's kind of what I want to share with you today. Kind of called it the prototype mindset, but really it's an accumulation of lessons I've learned, questions that I've asked myself that have fundamentally changed the way that I approach writing code. And it means to look at it a bit differently, with a bit more rigor, and realizing that there are many ways to write code. And I think this is something that's applicable to everyone, even if you yourself in your role don't necessarily prototype. And so instead of just telling you or talking at you about this, it's something that I would love for you to discover yourself and tailor it to your own situation. So my goal for you is to think about this a bit differently. Now, I know we're at the end of the day and everyone's a bit tired. Last time I did my talk at TriSwift, it was a live design talk. And what I didn't expect was that everyone was following along and making those designs as I went. So it gave me some inspiration for this year, which means that there's an element of audience participation. I'm going to be asking you all some questions and asking you to take a minute and really think about them. Now, you don't have to talk about this out loud. I would encourage you to grab a pen and paper, a notebook, or your laptop, and actually write these down. You'll have some time to do this. So you can do it for yourself. If you really want, you can share it on Twitter and get a conversation going there. You don't have to, it's completely up to you. But take a second and grab something to write something down with, and then we'll get started. Seems like a lot of people are going to write it on their phones, so I'm going to hope that you're not secretly checking Instagram while you're... So let's start off easy, and here's a warm-up question. Why are you a developer? Or whatever it is that you do, you may not actually do development, but I'm going to hazard a guess the majority of people here are. And take a minute and genuinely write something down. Right. So for me, personally, I just love making things for people that make them happy or that improves their lives in some kind of way. This is one of the reasons I got into doing iOS in the first place, because phones are such a personal thing that people carry around with them everywhere, and I just love being able to make experiences for that situation. So for you, it could be the same. It could be that you love solving challenging problems. It could be that you love learning new concepts, or that you enjoy your industry, your job, or the career that you have, or something else. There's many answers to this as there are people with us in the room today. So there's no right or wrong whatsoever, but the part that I wanted to call out is that it's important to realize what your motivations are, because they shape what we do, even if we don't realize them. It's reflected in every single thing we choose throughout our lives, and so it's worth keeping in mind, and this will become more clear as we go on. So now that you got a taste for how this is going to work, here's the first real question, which is, who do you write code for? So I think it's an interesting question because it leads on to what exactly is our job? The way I think about it is that it's a bit of an intersection between these three concepts. There's you, obviously. There is the company that you work for, or you freelance for, or the primary project that you work on, whatever shape it takes. And then there's the end user, which could be your customer, could be a business if you're in the B2B space, or a fellow developer if you work on tooling or open source. Now, with each of these, there are different aspects that play a part with them. These are just a few of them that I wrote down, but there are many, many more. And earlier we spoke about motivation, and it kind of determines where you land on this map, if you will. I'm very much towards the bottom. Like I said, I'm in it for changing people's lives to an extent. Sounds a bit dramatic, but let's go with that. And it has absolutely shaped everything I've done and all the different choices I've made through my career and the approach I've taken. Now, ideally there's a bit of a balance, but realistically speaking, none of us are ever perfectly in the middle. You work with your own motivations, but of course also different situations that happen. Things might change at work. The company might need different things. You might find yourself in different positions where you suddenly have to learn things, which we'll cover. So depending on the situation, you will easily sway around. And of course, sometimes it's hard to do everything, and you cannot do everything. So what I'd love to emphasize here is that by saying yes to something, it also means you're saying no to other things. Now, this might sound stupidly obvious, and in a way it is, and a lot of this presentation is. But it's worth reminding, and it's worth thinking about next time you volunteer for something, or you sign up for that project, or you start doing a new side project, or what, all of those different things, because taking that pause and being aware of what your motivations are, which direction you're going in, what impact that has, gives you the opportunity to really become very precise about your time and your output. So that means going back. Let's go forward. So let's move on to the second point. You've got your focused execution now. What happens when the tech stack that you use changes? Meaning you might need to use a different framework, a different language, or a different platform. How do you deal with that? What do you do when that happens? You may already experience this, maybe not. So take another minute or so. Right, so for me, this is probably one of the big points of my career and how I've worked. I've had to do a lot of different things, and so this concept became quite crucial quite quickly. I've, for example, done Python, mostly Objective-C, done some Swift. Then we moved on to React Native at Artsy. I've done TypeScript for that, and then started to use the React framework more and more, and now I actually find myself doing web development. Please be nice. And the point of that is that these things weren't always my choice. Sometimes they were. So I moved to the role that I have now because it gives me the opportunity to do what I've always wanted to do. So that speaks to the fulfillment part, if you will. Equally, the experiences we're working on at the moment are just so happen to be better suited for desktop, which is why I'm in the web dev space. And when we expand to mobile experiences, I'll probably go back to doing that. There have also been situations where it wasn't necessarily my choice. Like at Artsy, for example, we decided as a team and as a business that it was absolutely the right thing to move on to React Native and start building out all of our view controllers one by one in a completely different stack. And that was tricky, but equally absolutely the right choice. So the same might happen to you or has possibly already happened to you. So, again, I'm going back. You might just be starting, or you might be an expert in what you do, but how will you be resilient when the technology around us changes, which is all the time now? You can find yourself walking into a job and realize that there is a huge legacy code base, or that you suddenly have to integrate a C or C++ library into a Swift project, which, thanks to Cecile's talk, you now know how to do. It could be something that we don't even know yet. So it's worth thinking about how you would approach that. And for this, I think one of the best skills that you can learn and develop is learning how to learn. especially while continuing to ship. Again, an obvious point, but it still catches me off guard. I need to remind myself of this quite often. The very first time I encountered this quite severely was at Artsy when we swapped to React Native, and I realized that I suddenly wasn't able to estimate my work anymore. I wasn't sure how long things would take. I obviously didn't know what I didn't know. And what I ended up doing then is realizing that, well, combining learning with getting stuff out of the door essentially means that I have a framework now to make better choices and to take that time to actually learn, figure out what the docs are, spend some time reading a blog post. It's worth taking that afternoon and then making an educated choice about what to do next, then scrambling to keep writing code to get it out of the door as quick as possible, because inevitably we still need to do our work and keep getting it out. And that allowed me to get much more focused and in return also a lot faster at what I did. Which, speaking of time, third part to this is when writing code, how do you factor in how long this code needs to last for? So as developers, especially us who've come here to learn and get better at what it is that we do, we care about good and robust code, naturally. This is important to our teammates so that everything stays secure and readable, but of course also the end user. We don't want things to break on them. But realistically, how long does code last nowadays? What's the lifespan of it? I've seen things rewritten so quickly and so often that makes me think about how robust is robust enough? And how long does it take you to write something that's 100% resilient to anything that may happen? And should it take that long? And of course, I'm talking about kind of regular features here, not necessarily security or payment systems. For that, you might want to take a much more rigorous approach. But what can you learn by going faster? And imagine the freedom that you have if you could just achieve with something of a concept that is good enough. All this to say that I think sometimes as developers, we could do with being a lot less precious about our code. As I mentioned earlier, technology changes so quickly, even within one stack. Imagine, I don't know if anyone remembers FRP or functional reactive programming a few years ago, and the reactive Cocoa libraries that were amazing. There's still a lot of libraries out there that, projects that are written completely in that, whereas coming into it now, people might not even know how that works anymore if they just joined like an iOS platform in the last 2 years or so. But we become so attached to a language and a methodology in a way that we define our capabilities by the code that we write. But what if we also looked at it differently and defined it by the code we choose not to write, or how quickly we choose to rewrite things? Overall, all of that to say that it's worth starting to separate kind of how we see ourselves from the code that we write and be much more pragmatic about how we approach it. Which moves us right along to the fourth point. What has held you back from shipping your code? And now this could be a release, but I'm also talking about it on a much more individual and smaller level, like putting up your work for a PR or getting a colleague to come have a look at something. What has been holding you back from doing that? Now for me, if I'm honest, it's quite often fear, if you look at it deeply enough. There are things that I thought I should have done better, or that I should have looked at every single edge case or made sure everything was in the right condition before putting it up for review or shipping it out to users and so forth, which resulted in me being, again, quite precious about code when I shouldn't be. Yes, it's code that I write, but it's also code that's owned by the team. And what I've learned over time is that it's so much more helpful to lean on the combined skills of the team and share things much more quicker than I would have ever done before. Now, of course, I don't know what you wrote down, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it probably has something to do with fear as well, if you just keep digging. The underlying driver is probably fear, because even comments like, oh, well, but it wasn't done yet, or it didn't validate all the specs on the Jira ticket and it isn't completely ready, still have something to do with that, because we want to do a good job. and we worry about what happens if we don't. So this is a good thing. Caring about what we do means that we're good at what we do, and we take that extra level of polish. But equally, something that is so incredibly helpful and so often is in our way is fear. And so overcoming fear and becoming friends with it is really worthwhile, because it's not going to go anywhere. Like, that's just, even in life in general, right? It's always going to hang around and show up and be a resistance. But as soon as you start putting your things out there, often you realize actually there's not that much to be worried about. And so a quick work in progress PR or a hack that illustrates a certain concept to just check that you're on that direction and get feedback and comments from others eventually saves you so much time in the long run and makes you much more, again, focused and precise with what you do. So that leaves us to our final interactive question of the day, which is, how often do you test? Now that you ship more quickly, with more focus, learning as you go along, so being less precious about your code and putting it in front of people more quickly means that you do need to seek that validation elsewhere. And testing is a great way. Now, if you wrote something like, well, I run my tests every time I make a commit or merge a PR, well, that's great. But I'm not just talking about unit tests, but also testing with people. True, this might be a team effort and is something that you might do with your product managers or your design teams if you work with them. It's not just on us as developers. But at the end of the day, who are you writing your code for if it isn't your customers, your potential customers, or your fellow developers? They're the ones that use your stuff, that get confused, that find the bugs, that love what you've made, that champion and cheer you on. And at the end of the day, they are the ones that validate your work. So all that I can say is, in order to go faster and in order to ship your best work, it's not the best way to overcome that fear is basically to test early and often. Your unit tests make sure that what you wrote works correctly and as expected, but testing people to make sure that what you wrote has a purpose. So that's your part done. You can relax now. I've got about 2 minutes left. Here's a bit of what we looked at today. Why do we do what we do, and who do we do that for? What happens when the world around us changes, and how do we adapt to that? How does our code adapt to that? And if we want to make these impactful changes, what is it that stands in our way, and how can we find other ways of validating our work that isn't holding it inside and being worried about it? The reason I ask these questions out loud is because it's different for all of us. I've talked to you a bit through my experiences, but that's probably not a unified set at all. But these are questions and things that have preoccupied me for quite a while in the last few years, and these are some of the things that I learned and wanted to share with you. Even if you've got many, many years of experience, I think this is worth reminding ourselves of from time to time, because all of these concepts are linked. At the end of the day, this impacts how you build software and also defines why you build what you build. So a prototyping mindset, if you call it, is not just about hacking stuff and getting it done without any thought or care. If anything, it is becoming extremely clear on what you're doing, what for, and what you're hoping to get out of it. I wanted to pair this at this conference with all the other great content that you've seen today and will continue to see tomorrow, so you can think about building the right things before putting all that amazing knowledge to the test by building it right and beautifully. So go forth and be fearless. Thank you very much.